Welcome back to Consilience Conversations #2, and we find ourselves back with our fellow co-host here, Dr. Matthew Roos. Dr. Matthew Roos, welcome back.
Thanks. Great to be here once again.
It's great to have you, and it's funny, in the pre-show we were talking about what it is that we're going to talk about, and what's so interesting about this, and I watch other podcasts like the Dave Rubin podcast and the Joe Rogan podcast, and it's funny because I know that they always have a plan or an outline for what it is they're going to talk about, but since they follow their interest, sometimes they end up going fairly astray, and I feel like that's actually part of the strength of this medium, as opposed to, say, like a traditional lecture course. Like we of course do have a focus, and we do want to get out certain information, and we do want to cross literature and neuroscience here, but whoever knows which direction it will go.
There's another, I just thought of something. Well, let's be honest with ourselves. It also makes our lives our jobs a little bit easier here. We don't have to do as much prep work, although that could ultimately be a negative. But, maybe I'm using one of the cognitive failures. We're just motivated reasoning to explain why we are using this format rather than a more outlined or structured format. But so far, I'm an advocate.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And it's funny, it's interesting, after talking about the confirmation bias last week, and how that's sort of the opposite of how a scientist is supposed to think, whereas the scientist is supposed to perhaps see a pattern and then do everything that he can in order to disprove that the pattern is real. Mm-hmm. It seems like we as normal humans, and especially me, will sort of look for a pattern and then look only for additional evidence of that pattern. And so I was catching myself doing that, and I do that quite a bit, it looks like. So
I think we all do, and a lot of times, and that's part of being human. And some matters are not that important, so we don't need to spend a lot of time creating many alternative hypotheses and testing against our own hypotheses.
Right.
It's a very effective shortcut many times.
Yeah, no, and I agree. And it's like it seems like we would not have evolved that capacity if it weren't most of the time helpful, though at sometimes unhelpful.
Correct. Yeah, agreed.
And I guess we're just so sophisticated now as creatures, and society is just so sophisticated that we just cannot get away with that shortcut at all times and all moments at this point.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But it's funny. So just to dovetail a little, so what we wanted to talk about this time, expanding on our initial discussion on confirmation bias, were some of the errors of thought. And so you had me read a small selection from this work called Clue by Gary Marcus. But then more recently, we both started reading a work by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, which they were recently on Jordan Peterson about, suggesting that every K-12 administrator and teacher should have a copy of this book. And in this book, they also have a list of sort of cognitive biases or failures of thought that we wanted to talk about some today. Emotional reasoning, catastrophizing, overgeneralizing, dichotomous thinking, mind reading, labeling, negative filtering, discounting positives, blaming. But to actually dovetail in the way that I was thinking about, they do have a discussion of trauma early on in the first chapter as well. And I would like to mention that very quickly, because something you were asking me about earlier in the pre-show was, you were saying, well, how is it that you are going to join the image of Medusa, the Gorgon, the serpent-headed woman who turns people to stone, to this conversation? And well, are you ready to hear what I have to say on that?
I'm ready.
Okay, so let me drop it down. Dragon imagery exists throughout all literature and all cultures. You can find not only serpents in the Old Testament with Adam and Eve, but you find you find a dragon also in Revelation. You find images in the saints of the Catholics, St. George versus the dragon, St. Patrick, of course, expelling snakes from Ireland. You have also in contemporary British literature, like The Lord of the Rings, the Smog, the dragon that the Hobbit has to defeat, as well as in Harry Potter, of course, there's a basilisk, the king of snakes that Harry Potter has to kill. Not only that, but even in ancient literature, in the Iliad, you have images of snakes causing fear, but not only fear, but petrification. And for instance, in book 3 of the Iliad, Paris, who is the brother of Hector, who essentially caused the Trojan War by stealing Helen, he's described as running out in front of the Trojan ranks and looking every bit a hero. But when he sees Menelaus, the man whom he stole Helen from, he, like a man who has just almost stepped on a snake, turns whitish green and recoils in horror. And I thought that was wonderful. But where I take the main image of Medusa from is the story of of Perseus. Perseus was a son of Danae and a son of Zeus, and he was famous for receiving from Athena a mirror shield, for which he could use against Medusa to see her gaze through the mirror, through reflection rather than actuality, which is very similar to how each person who does not die by the basilisk's gaze in Harry Potter 2 does not die. They see a reflected image. And so sort of the idea in literature behind that is that before experiencing a traumatic event in reality, you can inoculate yourself against it, like how we physically inoculate ourselves against, say, polio by injecting a small amount of it so that our immune systems, which are very robust and anti-fragile, become stronger. Well, the idea seems to be the same with our minds. When you show evil, or you show the petrifying force of nature to humans, young humans especially, through the medium of literature or art, you help to inoculate them from the petrifying force of nature. And so how I wanted to connect that to the coddling of the American mind is that some data that Haidt has dredged up, which is really incredible to me, is that when people are traumatized, most people do overcome trauma. And part of how they overcome trauma is through exposure therapy, which means through representations of that which caused the trauma in the first place, they gain the competency necessary to deal with those experiences. And so I see the Medusa image as Medusa is that experience which traumatizes you or purely petrifies you, that you cannot handle. And the only way that you come to be able to handle it is through art, through a reflective shield, or through literature, something that represents the experience to you in a less volatile or violent way, so that you can start to accommodate to that situation, to use Piagetian terms. And I'm really hoping that you've got some brain science for me on this, some neuroscience, because I do think it's almost as if what you start to do is construct the situation in your mind without the horrifying stimulus being immediately present, which would shock you. And so that's my initial bit on Medusa. And so, well, what do you think about that? Was there anything interesting there? Yeah.
It's an interesting analogy for sure. And there's, it made me think of two things, just your commentary generally. One, which we probably don't need to go into here, is really just what is even the definition of trauma.
Right.
And so we have probably, as a society, generally agreed upon older definitions that were pretty solid, and that, the strongest example of that is soldiers that suffer from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. They've experienced a trauma that is the trauma of war, and some of the activities that go on there. But trauma has come, and this is, encroaching into another topic area that I know you're interested in, called concept creep.
Yes.
How that sort of definition or label of trauma has been in recent years really expanded, not really in recent years, just, through the course of decades. Although it's, some would claim, taking on really new, excessive broadening of its definition today. But leave that aside for a minute. The other thing I'm thinking about here is your description of Medusa, and when you say perhaps through the reflection, you're getting a sort of small piece of that trauma in a way, and that sort of can harden you towards it. So we could take the analogy a little bit too far incorrectly, in the sense that typically trauma is, something that occurs, and then now you're traumatized to it, and so it puts you in a great state of fear or anxiety if you experience this again, or have experience some stimuli that reminds you of that traumatizing event. But the cognitive behavioral therapy that Haidt and Lukianoff discuss is, then that's this exposure to small pieces of that to ultimately sort of habituate you to that stimulus, and remove ultimately that fear response or that anxiety response when you're exposed to those sort of triggers or those associated stimuli. Now, in your Medusa example, it's more, you're seeing a little piece of the Medusa, and that's hardening to you, and you of course related it to taking a vaccine, for example. And so that's something that you do beforehand in order to prevent this sort of trauma from occurring, although that's perhaps not the right term for trauma there. But all in all, I think it's it's an interesting interpretation. Of course, my understanding from the mythology is you're never really going to be inoculated against the Medusa, right? If you see the Medusa, it's done. You're done. So maybe the analogy fails just a little bit there, but I do like where you're going with it.
Well, I don't know if it does, because the thing is, you do see, Perseus does see her, but sees her through reflection, sees her through the medium. And so something we do at, say, the high school class is like, one of the works that we teach is Heart of Darkness, which is and another one is The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. These are war stories. And so I guess part of the question might be, why do we teach war stories to these young humans, these young people? Well, part of the idea is that war is part of life. And we don't want them simply to have a historical understanding of what happens in war, but we want them to have an understanding of what humans are like, so that when they run into difficult situations, and potentially if they become soldiers, and potentially if they find themselves in terrible situations doing terrible things as soldiers for whatever reason, they might have more of a chance of not being traumatized, because with their minds as anti-fragile systems, having to some extent experienced at a much more diluted or watered down level what's happening, that that they might not suffer the initial trauma in the same way that somebody who was more naive would. And so that's how I'm sort of seeing the Medusa, not necessarily that she's just seen in part, but that she's seen as a reflection, or through a different medium, or like, say, through a veil, rather than in all her horror all at once. It's almost as if what she represents is is nature, part of which is your inner nature as a human, which if you're a soldier, say in Vietnam, perhaps you did something at some point that you could not comprehend with your then vision of reality and who you were within it. Perhaps you killed somebody during the course of battle. Perhaps you mistreated somebody. And I'm not trying to impugn any sort of troops, but it is the fact that people often who get traumatized are traumatized not simply by that which they see, but that which they do as well. And so I'm sort of suggesting the idea that having a more robust idea of human nature through greater experience through art and literature can make you actually safer in the world if you consider being traumatized a danger in the world.
And perhaps, perhaps that exposure to these ideas, the literature, the art, as you suggested, just prepares, as you said, you might divide this into sort of, we don't just study history as if it's a bunch of facts.
Right.
We often do, but we want to have a deeper understanding. We want to educate people to have a deeper understanding of the social implications, the how lives are actually impacted by this, and the emotions. And so perhaps, that education through that literature, art, may also give people a sense of what will happen if we get into these situations or take on wars or battles.
Right.
What are the costs there that go beyond just a number of casualties, but sort of the long-term impacts on people's lives.
Right. And and I do want to talk about concept creep and how trauma has been redefined from something that happens, which is physical, right? It used to just be blunt force trauma to your head, to something that became psychological in the DSM, to the main psychological manual, the diagnostics and statistics manual that the psychologists use for their diagnostic criteria. I do want to talk about how it's gone from a physical definition to a psychological definition to a much more watered down psychological condition. And then tie that to the idea that students are fragile systems who need safe spaces, who are incapable of dealing with that which could potentially produce trauma in them. But I guess the thrust of what I'm trying to ask, there are a couple, is this: in exposing a student to a terrible aspect of life through literature, possibly even something fantastic, like, say, for instance, Dante's Inferno. Obviously, that's not a physical place, and it's sort of a fantastic environment. And so there's sort of a layer of artistic safety between you and the terrifying experience. But I wanted to sort of connect that to rats and how a rat would react to, say, a threat or to a cat. Something Jordan Peterson talks about in his lectures in Maps of Meaning is that if you waft the smell of a cat over a rat who's in a cage, which it has explored and made known territory, it will skirt along the walls and then like make a little rat sound indicating threat. And then it will slowly do these corner runs in order to redefine known territory, because the smell of the cat and the immediate presence of the threat in front of it sort of traumatizes it to a small extent, and then it has to rebuild its known territory. It has to rebuild its world. And so
maybe that, sorry, I'll just interrupt quickly. And so I don't know that I'm aware of those types of studies, exactly those type of rats, and some sort of anxiety or fear-inducing stimulus, in this case, of course, cat urine or cat fur. But it's also possible that that animal, that is the rat, is creating a new territory. The rats have glands that put out chemicals that the other rats can detect as well. So not only is that a response that maybe the rat is informing itself or learning for itself a new space, but that information will be picked up by other rats. So this could be sort of I don't want to say a swarm behavior, but that could be a beneficial behavior to the other animals in a ecological situation, natural ecological situation.
Well, that's excellent, because what I want to make an analogy to is a human's known territory. So what trauma seems to be is a human going outside known territory into the unknown, and then being unable to adapt their map, unable to integrate the new experience into the known territory, and thus expand their map. So I wondered to what extent trauma, and I guess we can tighten up the definition and talk about concept creep as soon as we want to, is a result of a human encountering an unknown piece of information which they are incapable of incorporating into their map of reality. It is a failure of a human to change the unknown into known territory. And I guess what's underlying that statement is, I think what I'm suggesting is that what a human's territory is, and we even speak this way when we talk about area of expertise, or this is my field of study, is that our territory is not simply physical, but also psychological. That we also, because we learn and we don't just act behaviorally, we also have to some extent some small consciousness that works on our experience and memories, that we actually have a map, a territory within our minds that helps us to behave in our situations, and that in whatever situation we find ourselves in. And that what trauma is sort of a disruption of that map and that keeps you from updating it in such a way as you can move forward past the petrification process. It's as if what trauma does is leaves us in the moment when the rat smells the cat and freezes. And it's like, okay, what do we need to do? Well, what does the rat do? Well, the rat starts doing corner runs in order to reconstruct its territory. Well, what does a human have to do? Well, it seems like we have to start, exposing ourselves to the territory we once thought was safe, was known territory, which has now become unknown territory because of this new stimulus or anomaly, and which we now need to remap. I was wondering what you would think about that.
Well, let me add a little bit to these definitions, or perhaps modify them, or we can just discuss that. But so a key thing that I think you sort of left out, but which doesn't mean your definition was incorrect. I would narrow it down a little bit. Is that it's the you said sort of maybe you experience or encounter some information, and that information may be an event that is, of course, a physical realization of information, and you are unable to sort of incorporate that into your schema or your map or your of course we experience that all the time, in the sense that we come across things that have no real emotional valence to them. They don't really affect us emotionally. And so, oh, I don't understand this, or it's sort of, some sort of, I can't place it into my experience. Oh, well, you just go on your day, just keep on going. But of course, trauma is, at least, especially in the more classical definition, is something that is highly emotional, impactful, and often something that is related to emotions of fear or anxiety. And so, I'm not a clinician, and I don't truly know a lot about this topic, but I think in general, it'd be something that is so sort of emotionally devastating, and that individual does not have the sort of the tools, I shouldn't even say the cognitive tools, the neural tools to deal with that, particularly if they are re-exposed to some element, some trigger that reminds me of that situation.
Right. Yeah.
So sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought there, but I was thinking about this a little bit in terms of animals and fight or flight, and I think this may be going a little bit afield from where we want to take this conversation, but the fight or flight reflex serves a purpose. It's that, in evolution, an animal, when observes something that is dangerous to that animal, it needs to take an action, and it can't sit there and think. It can't take a long time to process the situation and come up with a variety of alternatives. It needs to do one of these two things. Really three things: fight or flight or freeze. And to listeners who may not be so aware, sometimes freezing is the right thing to do because the sort of attacking animal or whatever the danger is may just go away, especially if they don't even notice that animal, the prey, anymore. And so that involves a cascade of processes, but really the fight or flight involves nervous system changes, basically some of them physical, or many of them very physical, so that the animal, the heart rate might go up, the blood vessels expand. It's essentially ready for physical activity. Now, this is maybe a tenuous connection, but with trauma, you don't have a fight. You experience sort of these same things, and so these hormonal changes occur rapidly, and they are sort of tied to this whatever the event itself was, and somehow that bonds that event to your fear system or your anxiety system. So that's what's really you're hypersensitive to triggers there.
Could you talk a little bit more about those systems of fear and anxiety in us? I know you mentioned the limbic system a little bit last time, and you actually mentioned that even reptiles, I made a joke about them, have fairly sophisticated brains, and quite a bit of our brain, you called it the ancient brain, we still share with the lower animals, and their fight and flight. So would you be able to just tell us and the listeners a little bit about the limbic system and what you mean when you say bonding the experience to the fear systems, so that the fear systems might be more sensitive to a similar stimulus in the future?
Well, I can only take it so far, but I'll tell you what I know. As I mentioned, there's a lot of things that we don't understand. So if you see something that is perceived as danger, of course, there's a whole question of how do you even perceive that is danger, right? And some things may be, in some sense, innate in our system. Actually, you mentioned how, this reminds me that you mentioned dragons or serpents as being a theme. And there is sort of evidence that, there's an innate fear of snakes in people. That doesn't mean every person fears them with severe dread, but it's something that's almost ingrained in us. So there may be a little bit of that, but how is it? So, the amygdala is one of the most, is really an area that is highly responsible for, I'll say that part of the brain is very active when we are experiencing fear or anxiety or danger. And it's not clear how that comes about, right? It's like almost like it's bypassed, the sensory input is bypassing, or almost the information is somehow being processed by the amygdala itself, almost in a way separate from our our high level cognitive processes.
That's
in a
fascinating.
way that makes sense, because those ancient animals in the ancient brain didn't have the depth of cortex or the extent of cortex that we have. That is the newer brain, our thinking brain. So somehow it did it, and so does ours. Now we have, there's a slightly slower response by our sort of newer brains, the cortex, and that can sort of compensate or make alternate choices versus fight or flight. We can get ourselves to pause for a minute and assess the situation. I'm talking particularly about things that are not truly dangerous to us. They may stoke sort of fear or anxiety, but just thinking about when you're in the workplace and you might have to give some presentation, or you're under the gun by your boss or some customer for something. And so clearly you're not going to take a physical fight or flight reaction there. But nonetheless, those systems can be activated. That's essentially stress, right? That's the sort of activation of that system that can, some people through their jobs experience that stress day in and day out, and it's actually physically detrimental to them.
Well, that makes me want to ask you just a very quick question, which maybe this will open an avenue that we'll have many episodes we can talk about. But the fact that you're suggesting that patterns might be represented on the visual cortex, and then move down to the amygdala and bypass the prefrontal cortex, the decision-making engine, and then be directly perceived by the amygdala, makes me think that what it perceives is the meaning of a situation or the emotional valence of a situation, rather than scientifically understanding the physical component parts of it in the same way that, say, our prefrontal cortex.
Right. It's sort of I'll just interrupt quickly. I think it's a sort of an interesting or challenging conundrum as a neuroscientist to resolve these. That is, how can you know? Let's just go to the simple predator and prey animal situation. And that animal, the prey animal sees the predator animal, and it's some sort of cat, mountain cat, and it has to. I think you're right. What you said is completely right. What that area of the brain is doing is processing and distilling the actual level of danger from that situation. But how can it do that unless it also knows the orientation of that animal, like that's its body relative to that of the prey, where that gaze of that prey animal is.
Right. So
and we think of that as a lot of that is accomplished in the earlier sort of low areas of the cortex, primary visual cortex. But, we often think of situations where you really need a lot more information. You really have to have a lot of information to know whether there's really a danger or not. I guess our personal human experience would be more like crossing the street and you turn and see a vehicle coming at you headlong. You had to sort of recognize the whole situation and the orientation and relative position of everything to know that you're in danger. So there is certainly some level of processing going on, but it just it may be that we've some of those are so used that is every day we are walking around in the environment, experiencing moving vehicles for ourselves or moving objects, and so that becomes such a low level. Like a lot of that processing needed to recognize those relationships ends up really not being in the prefrontal cortex. It's at very low level cortical areas, and that's enough information for the amygdala to then operate on and assess whether there's a danger there. So
that's right. And that's really interesting, because we'll just several things all at once. I would make the claim then that mythology, the language it speaks, is the language of the amygdala. That why mythology seems to not square with science, which I would take, or empirical science, which I would take to be the language of the the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the consciousness that arises from that, and several other subcomponents. Like, we don't know about consciousness as much as we'd like to yet, but we're getting there. But that what mythology represents are marquee situations of extreme motivational valence or extreme emotion. Moments when, like, say, a predator is in front of you, and whether that predator is a dragon or a giant man who is going to kill you, or a situation where you are about to lose your wife or something like that. What mythology seeks to explore are those moments when you experience fight or flight, those marquee emotional moments, not simply the fight or flight ones, but I think it speaks the language of the lower brain. And that's why the images are often so interesting. And so just to put that claim to a side for a moment, what you said about the amygdala's processing and the fact that it sort of has an unsophisticated version of predator that we then use the prefrontal cortex in our thinking to sort of clear up and clean up makes me, while I look at these cognitive biases, especially labeling, overgeneralizing, and the confirmation bias, and what Jonathan Haidt and Lukianoff talk about with a post hoc reasoning, makes me think that often what we do is experience an emotion and then we try and label it with our mind. We don't think through it necessarily so much as, oh, I must feel this way, this emotional reasoning / labeling. I feel this way now, therefore the person in front of me, like I feel scared, therefore the person in front of me is a threat. Therefore I categorize them as predator. And my reasoning for why they are a predator is they made me feel scared. And
yeah, I think it's a combination of what they call, or others call, emotional reasoning, as you just mentioned, tied, and this is, it sounds like to me what you just described, coupled with the motivational reasoning. So right. They're somehow motivated, and part of the motivation might just be to quickly explain this emotion that I'm feeling, and without giving it much more thought than that, I must feel this way, so that something must be wrong. And we're done, and then then the fingers start pointing.
Well, that's incredible, because it makes me understand now why we go to watch scary movies, right? Because part of the reason seems to be that we want that limbic system arousal without actual real threat. So we need to be sucked into the movie enough, and this is probably why we go to amusement parks too. We want to be in an actually safe situation in which we feel threatened, so that we can get that physiological arousal, which I suppose makes us feel good to some extent.
Yeah, sure. Especially for some people, they actually, we all get this sort of adrenaline, or there are multiple hormones that are released into the bloodstream, and it gives us this sort of like, you could call it a bit of a slight artificial high, although it's not artificial. It might be artificially driven by the amusement park that you're at, but it's, it's naturally generated by your body. And some people seem to like that. Others, they might not dislike that, but they may be more overwhelmed by the negative emotional aspect of even though the danger is not real, the sort of simulated danger.
Right. So with mythology, to tie that back, what I think that must be is a first pass approximation at us trying to explain situations through stories which cause that sort of arousal, because we exist in a society which is too sophisticated to simply rely on our basic ancient brain reactions. Like you were saying, if all we ever did was be afraid of fast-moving big things like bears, well, then cars, we could not deal with them. We have to acclimate to them to some extent. And if we just have one bad interaction with someone who yells at us, and we put them in the predator category, and they're our boss or our teacher or our spouse for that matter, that's not going to work. We have to be far more sophisticated than that. So part of what I'm starting to understand is that some of these biases come about because we have this ancient machinery, and we're constantly put in these situations where the ancient machinery is active. Like, I mean, just think about somebody cutting you off in your car. You're scared, all of a sudden your adrenaline's pumping, you feel threatened as well. You say all sorts of nasty stuff about that person immediately, but then, like, say you've just been going for a spot, but you happen to be colleagues at the same school. You have to very quickly clean up that situation with your mind and establish a more sophisticated understanding of the situation than your ancient brain would immediately suggest to you, which is like, this is a threat or this is a competitor and you need to fight against this person. Whereas it's like, well, this is my colleague. I have to spend the next 150 days teaching alongside them. And like there's a 10-year-long career maybe I want, or a 50-year-long career. And I need to actually,
or even they're nobody you've ever met before, but that doesn't mean that you have one negative experience with that person. That doesn't mean they're the worst person in the world. Things happen, oftentimes inadvertently. And so our initial reaction may be very emotional, to be either angry or scared. But ultimately we need to, when we can, take the time to consider the alternatives, that this person is a person and they may have been, inattentive in their driving or something, but not, which could be angering, but there's no real harm intended there.
Right. And I mean, it just strikes me that what mythology attempts to represent then is the experience of a situation like that, couched within a narrative so that you know how to appropriately behave in such a situation. So for example, I teach the Iliad, and one of the first interactions that we observe is between sort of an alpha male, Achilles, who's the top warrior who's sacked 23 cities, and I think I brought this up last time, and the king of the army, Agamemnon. So the one guy has all the power in terms of political power, Agamemnon. He commands 100 out of 1,000 ships. Everybody listens to him. Nestor, the wisest man, says he's the boss. And so he's the boss. But Achilles has all this physical strength. And so what we run into in this mythological tale is, well, then how do you settle this dispute? Do you settle it through the usual way from the generation before, like what Heracles would do, which is fight it out? Or have we now reached a situation in culture where now we're massing in a more sophisticated way? This is a story that talks about the setting of the nation of the ancient Greeks, where now this sort of dominance ritual through physical prowess is not going to make the group as strong as a more politicized version of conflict. And so how are you going to act? Because your ancient brain is going to say, fight and kill this man. And actually what happens with Achilles is he's about to pull out his sword and kill Agamemnon, but a goddess pulls him by the back of his head, the goddess of wisdom, which suggests to me, if we're correct that this language of mythology is the language of the limbic system, that what's being suggested there is a thought occurs to him, like maybe this is not the best thing to do, even though my emotions are all telling me 100% kill this man who has slighted me right now.
It's interesting. I like that. As you mentioned there, and I'm not aware if this is a generalized statement that could be made, but sort of the history of mythology, that is the progression of the stories as they came to be in the world, in the real world. Those stories were told, and it sounds like these stories evolved in a way that similar to our society has evolved.
Yes.
Actually, I've been wanting to say this for the past few minutes. I was reminded. Actually, I stumbled across this quote actually just earlier today. But it's by one of the neuroscientists. I believe you know of him, but he's Antonio Damasio. He's a neuroscientist at University of California, San Diego. But the quote is, "We are not thinking machines that feel; we are feeling machines that think." Yes. And so that really sums up almost all. Like that's for our emotions really are central in our decision making, and that's just something that a lot of people don't realize. And that's, I think, sort of what this whole series that you're interested in is talking about. But it also can relate to the mythology, and where in this arc of people moving from machines that purely feel to machines that purely think. And of course, we are not machines that purely think, but where in the arc of where in that arc do some of these characters or stories in mythology lie? That's great stuff, Matt. I think that's very good. And well, that makes me want to ask you this question. In a work prior to the Coddling of the American Mind with Lukianoff, Haidt wrote a book. I always forget the title of it. It's Why Good People Are. It's about politics. It's his most and religion. Yeah.
And religion, right? It's a psychology of religion and politics book, and it's like why good people get into fights or something like that. I suppose I could look it up really quickly.
No, I think it's something. Yeah, you're close. I think it's something like why good.
The righteous mind. Why good people are divided by politics and religion.
Right.
So he makes a claim there that I think is very much anti-enlightenment claim, though I think probably correct in terms of empirical science. He says that the conscious mind is like a rider on an elephant, which would be the sort of ancient brain that you've talked about before. So most of the time, the elephant, which is much stronger and bigger, is in charge, but the rider can sort of slightly guide and contextualize things for the elephant. And so I wondered, I want your input on whether you think that that's a fair or good analogy for sort of the difference between the limbic system or the ancient brain systems and the prefrontal cortex or the conscious mind. Not to make those the same, obviously they're not. But.
Yeah, I don't think it's bad. I don't know. I don't have a strong feeling about it. I think it's somewhat apt to say that you have this older brain, and maybe that's the elephant in this case that is taking care of the bulk of the work physically in that part, but also, call it even if it's a horse or something, an animal that someone might use for transportation kind of knows where it's going or what to do most of the time. You only need to steer it around a little bit. On the other hand, again, on this sort of arc between thinking machines that feel and feeling machines that think, we'd like to think that we're really in charge of that elephant. And in some ways we are, right? And I think this is what you meant, or what you were saying, the context, like the world around you, you're the one that's taking all this other information in and making greater plans, like planning ahead, figuring out why you might want to go to location A versus location B, and directing that animal. On the other hand, once in a while, that animal's going to get away from you a little bit, and so do our ancient minds.
Right. And well, it's just interesting because it strikes me that certain cognitive tricks we learn to do and certain distortions like labeling we use in order to produce a certain reaction in our elephant to maintain our group biases. So if I, for example, am a, like, say, super left Democrat, and I hate everything associated with conservatives, and so, well, what do I want to do in order to A, maintain my known territory and not learn anything anomalous, and B, maintain my feeling? Well, how about I label every conservative / Republican as either as predator, as potential Trump, right? It's interesting because it's almost like this is enlightening me about the news cycle, and also how political discourse sort of devolves out of control or fails to enact shared information between sides, right? Because if I'm motivated already to be right in order to maintain my in-group status with, say, other liberals, then I don't want to be agreeing with other conservatives. And also I'm motivated to perceive them as a threat to myself for multiple reasons. A, because if they have information that's anomalous to me, they might change my self-conception and thus my group affiliation and thus my level of safety, so I perceive it. But also
perceived as, let me add to that, perceived in the sense that now you may be ostracized or looked down upon from your own group that you already feel like you're a strong member of.
Right, exactly. So I'm actually motivated not to learn about these people and to demonize them in order to maintain my known territory and my group status. And that is exactly what you would expect from this information, right?
And let's remind people that this is, and that doesn't mean that people are cognitive, conscious that they are doing this. Or that's sort of why they are doing this. It's just, and it's sort of a bit of a hypothesis that that's why they are doing that. Sure. Although the psychologists that study these things should demonstrate that these are behavioral realities. Now, what really is the sort of neuroscience or cognition underneath it is always much more complicated, but it's certainly exposed by behavioral experiments.
That's incredible, because even just looking down this list, like discounting positives, if say I'm conservative and or say like I'm like, super right nationalist Republican, like the most right I can possibly be, then I'm never going to want to see anything positive that the left does. And if I'm super progressive left, then I'm never going to want to see anything positive about the right, which
Well, I would just caution you to use the word when using the word want in these statements.
Sure.
I think, I think you and I and listeners generally understand what you mean by that, but it's not a conscious decision. Most people think of wanting something as a conscious
right. No, that's a good point.
Awareness, but that's not the case here.
Well, so it's even more pernicious, right? That I'm not simply motivated to perceive the situation in that way without being conscious of the fact that this is happening. That's simply how I see the situation,
mm-hmm.
right?
Right. And you mentioned, I think maybe overgeneralizing but like negative filtering is another one that they use, which is, you really only, you're sort of just filtering out anything positive about the message from somebody else and just taking in the negative and then catastrophizing it into a space where you just don't want to, you think nothing of the positives there. So
right. And
how are you ever going to shift your thought? Or you don't necessarily have to just because you have that position doesn't mean your position is wrong.
Right.
If you're not being a critical thinker about the other person or group's position, well, then you're never actually, you may make the error of having perhaps an unjustifiable position yourself.
Right. And I see two problems with that, because just because you are not members of one in-group or not shared members of one in-group does not mean that you are not members of another broader or more inclusive group. Like say, if we're Republicans, or I'm a Republican and you're a Democrat, we're both still Americans. We're both still scholars, and we're both still teachers, and we both speak English, and we have so many different things or so many different groups that we share membership in, that simply focusing on the differences in one group is inappropriate. It is not the only. We do not simply exist in one group each that are opposite, that are opposed to each other. And also, what that seems to be a problem about is if you are in a group different from mine, which means you have different perspectives and different sorts of information from me, like as you do as a neuroscientist, then you are an extraordinary source of information for me. You're like a golden goose. If I actually listen to you, if I'm motivated to listen to you in order to acquire new information to inform my perspective, then you are precisely the person I want to hear from, rather than the person who I should just or naturally define as
the usual echo chamber problem. If you just isolate yourself with people that have the same thoughts that you do.
Right, and that's sort of showing me what the difference between, like, say, a human and an animal is. Like you were saying with say, like a lower animal, like a dog or a rat or a cat, that has this amygdala response of fight, flight, or run. Well, it has to fight, flight, or run, fight, flight, or freeze. But with me, if I encounter you and you have, say, a different political opinion from me, and boom, you're all of a sudden a threat because you're in a different in-group, and I freeze, well, then I do have access to my conscious mind, right? I can't reframe the situation where we are two interlocutors within, a shared state and have shared beliefs and values, at least based on, say, like the Constitution, if we even had to go that far back. And that you are potentially someone who will make me safer and more robust and more secure within my territory by informing me of that which I do not know.
This reminds me of this is a little bit of a tangent, but it reminds me of, this is a recent article, scientific article that came out just earlier this month, or maybe a month or so ago, and it was one in which these scientists, and I guess these were really social scientists, they built sort of like a social media platform, and they had people go on there and discuss some contentious political topic, right? And they had several different scenarios or several different separate experiments. And in one case, the participants, they only see it's just like going to any chat room or any social media platform generally, and you see comments by other people, and you see posting of news articles. I think what they did was they actually put just one news article, and then or a set of sort of empirical evidence, and then they let people chat. In one condition, they had sort of like a donkey or a elephant attached to each person's name, right? So the participants knew the affiliations of the other members. And then the other extreme was a chat room where they did that, and there was no affiliation, no identifier, no cue, so they wouldn't know what someone's declared political affiliation was. And what they found is that, perhaps really unsurprisingly, I would say, but when asked a question about inferring or understanding what the data meant, the consensus was much stronger when they didn't have these cues as to what party the other participants were in. And in the first case, where they were labeled as such, they really just could not come to a consensus that, those that were the Democrats really interpreted the data much differently than those that were the Republicans. So, there are multiple aspects there, but this sort of motivated reasoning is one of them, and labeling, which is sort of what got us into this study, into this conversation, the labeling of these individuals as being in one group or another. So I thought it was a really interesting study. Perhaps it's something we could dig into a little bit some other time. But
yeah, I'd really love to, because it's as if what that does is focuses the conscious mind on labeling, and labeling this person as other, and labeling other as threat, and thus post hoc developing reasoning, or developing one's thoughts in order to defeat or to enter into conflict with this other person, because the moment that they are labeled as donkey and you are elephant, then
right.
you are already at odds.
They're already at odds. Yeah, they are just they exhibit many of these what Haidt calls these cognitive distortions, and it prevents them from forming a sort of social learning and coming to a consensus.
Well, what's so fascinating about that is, these conversations, I know that we're laying down a lot of mythology and science here, but this strikes me as exactly the sort of conversation that we need to be having as a people, because our current solution seems to be that we just shouldn't label anything. And yet we still do, because of course we have to, and that all labels are relative. And that seems like a very unsophisticated and not neurologically or neuroscientifically supported, or literally or mythologically supported way to do anything.
Well, we have language and we need terms for things in order to have a discussion. So things, there's a sort of a difference between a label and a definition, or it becomes perhaps hazy at some point. What's what, and usually the term label often has a negative connotation, in the sense that it binds everything together, and then it allows you to think of everything within that label as a homogeneous set, and they are not a homogeneous set. They're diverse set, and that can be tied to, once again, this can go back to concept creep, where we talked about trauma already, and trauma used to have this a certain definition, and that definition expanded, and sometimes that expansion is good. It recognizes, for example, you mentioned the sort of physical trauma, and then we went into psychological trauma, and there are various forms of psychological trauma. But then it can expand so much that something that most of us would just take to be a bad day sort of experience, and somehow define that as trauma. And so, it gets to be murky if you allow that definition or that label to expand so much that you don't have a nuanced language to tease these things apart.
Well, and that's precisely the problem. And I think you hit the nail on the head, and maybe we can close with your thoughts on this, but it seems as if that concept creep is tied to this movement that we've had, where we've been becoming more naive and less sophisticated about that which we know. Even though we have been producing more and more empirical data, and we are the most sophisticated that we have ever been in terms of methodology and access to facts and distribution of facts through technology. I mean, the fact that we're even speaking right now, and that we can be doing something like this, I think is testament to that. It seems like what we need to be doing is taking account of this very good science we've done and becoming more sophisticated in our thinking, understanding that there is an elephant, an ancient brain in us, understanding how it motivates us to think in a certain way, understanding these distortions, observing, in a clinical way, observing our own behaviors, our own thoughts, our own actions towards others, and then identifying these behaviors and these distortions within ourselves in order to actually be genuine and good towards those in our lives, in our actual in-groups. It's as if our solution has been to get hazier and to get sloppier and to let our concepts creep and to claim that we can't know anything, while on the other end, we're actually learning more than we've ever learned before in existence.
Sure,
and need to be a little more sophisticated in how we talk about what it is that we know.
Yeah, I think about my response to that would be, certainly the more we know about ourselves, as is not we as a society, but like as more an individual knows about their thought processes, the better they are going to be able to become a critical thinker and put emotions aside or understand some of these biases or distortions that may come about and find ways to counter that. We have these, we all have this. Another factor, though, or another thing to think about is how, and this is more, how do we as a society, how do we build platforms? How do we host discussions? How do we, how does our political system work in terms of, the debates, the interactions? How do we do this in such a way that we're not basically bad actors can't easily come in and pervert things. And I don't mean necessarily, a foreign entity coming in and taking over our, trying to spread false news around. I just mean even ourselves, like even our own sort of internal country or state or city. And how do we, knowing what we know about the sort of the psychology and the neuroscience of these cognitive sort of errors, how can we as a society construct ways to counter those, and ways that counter them, even though some people may not be aware that they themselves have these biases inside, in their thinking?
Well, perhaps what we're doing here is constructing something of a shield of Perseus, so that others can reflect not only on Medusa, but on themselves and their own thoughts. And perhaps we can model that behavior here. I guess that is what we're doing, right? We are, coming across disciplines across the country to speak, and because we share an understanding that it's so important to meld this data into the public consciousness and to help share and distribute it, because it's real, it's good, and it's helpful.
I love how you pulled it back to, got the shield of Perseus in there. That was a great, you really brought it back, and I like it.
Thank you. I got to add something here. You're the real scientist here, so I've got to be able to make some analogies every now and then, ask some good questions.
That was a good one.
Well, I think we're just about at an hour right now, Matt. Would you, and so just to let the listeners know, we're reading through this new book by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, The Coddling of the American Mind. And that's already had me buy a couple of new books, including Anti-Fragile by Nassim Taleb. But a question I want to ask you about next time, and we can set up what we want to talk about next time, would definitely be to ask, is a human brain an anti-fragile system? And I don't want to get into that too much now, but
sounds great. Looking forward to that conversation.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you taking the time. Matt, just for the listeners to know, Dr. Matt Roos just had a birthday yesterday, so happy birthday to him. And
thanks, Alex. And thanks to any listeners that want to wish me well as well.
Yeah, and just to let the listeners know, we did have a couple questions by one Daniel Babcock, and he asked the one question we asked him not to ask, which was about free will, but that's fine. We will get to your questions eventually. I think Babcock, if you're listening, and I'll be sending this to you, so I hope you do, we will post your questions onto either this podcast or the next podcast, and then we can do our best with them. And if any other listeners ever want to call in, I really appreciate questions, and I'm sure you do too, Matt. And questions make the conversation, and so good questions, are very, very helpful. And no question really is too stupid.
Agreed.
Yeah. Well, again, I appreciate your time, Matt, and I'm going to be thinking a lot about my thinking over the next couple weeks. And just so the listeners know, we've decided on doing this every 2 weeks so that we have time to prepare. This sort of a preparation heavy podcast. We kind of have to have our stuff together for it. But look forward to another one of these in 2 weeks.
Thanks, Alex.
Thank you.